Imagine a country so large that it stretches across two continents, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the warm coasts of the Black Sea, a land filled with hundreds of languages, traditions, and people. This was Russia in the early 1900s, a country full of beauty, power, and deep problems. Before the Soviet Union ever existed, Russia was ruled by a powerful king called the Tsar. His name was Nicholas II, and like many kings before him, he ruled with complete control. The Tsar and his family lived in grand palaces filled with chandeliers and gold. But outside those palace walls, millions of people struggled to survive. Most of the population were peasants, farmers who worked hard every day but earned very little. They had small huts, barely enough food, and almost no say in how the country was run. There were also workers in factories who lived in crowded cities and faced long hours with little pay. As time went on, people began to grow angry. They saw how unfair the system was. Some started reading new ideas, books that talked about equality, fairness, and sharing wealth. Among these ideas was something called communism, first described by Karl Marx. His dream was that all people should share what they produce, and no one should live in extreme luxury while others starve. By the early 1900s, anger in Russia had turned into unrest. The First World War made everything worse. Millions of soldiers were sent to fight, but they lacked proper food and weapons. Back home, families were starving and prices rose every day. People started to say, "We need change." In 1917, this frustration turned into something huge, a revolution. Crowds filled the streets of Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, demanding bread, peace, and land. The Tsar's soldiers, tired and hungry, refused to fire on the people. Instead, they joined them. Soon, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to give up his throne. After more than 300 years of royal rule, the Russian Empire ended. In its place, chaos began, and a group of revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin saw their chance. Lenin was a smart, determined man who had spent years fighting for his beliefs. He led a group called the Bolsheviks, who believed that power should belong to the workers and peasants. In October 1917, Lenin and his followers took control of the government in what became known as the Bolshevik Revolution. It was fast, dramatic, and changed world history forever. The Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread, the three things people needed most. But peace did not come immediately. A civil war broke out between the Bolsheviks, called the Reds, and those who opposed them, the Whites. It was a brutal, bloody conflict that tore Russia apart from 1918 to 1922. Millions died, cities were destroyed, and families were separated. In the end, the Reds won. Lenin and the Bolsheviks created a new country in 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. It brought together Russia and several surrounding lands like Ukraine, Belarus, and the countries of Central Asia. The Soviet Union was born. At first, many people believed this was the beginning of a better world. The new government promised that there would be no more rich or poor, no kings, and no unfair bosses. Everyone would work together for the common good. Factories, farms, and lands were no longer owned by individuals. They now belonged to the state, meaning the people, in theory. The red flag with a hammer and sickle became the symbol of this new dream. The hammer for workers, the sickle for farmers, and the star for unity. The streets were filled with parades and songs about freedom and the future. Schools taught children that they were building a new kind of society, one without greed or inequality. For many, it was inspiring. Millions of people worked hard, believing they were part of something historic, the building of a fair, modern, and united world. But this dream was not simple. In 1924, just a few years after founding the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin fell ill and died. His death left a huge question: who would lead the country next? Two men stood out: Leon Trotsky, a brilliant speaker and revolutionary thinker, and Joseph Stalin, a quiet but cunning political organizer. Stalin was not as famous as Trotsky, but he was careful, strategic, and ambitious. Over time, Stalin used his position to gain power inside the Communist Party. He slowly removed those who opposed him, including Trotsky, who was forced to flee the country. By the late 1920s, Stalin was the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin believed that the Soviet Union needed to become strong, fast. He feared that Western countries would attack one day, and he wanted to make sure the USSR could defend itself. To do that, he began a huge plan called the 5-Year Plans. Factories had to produce more steel, coal, and machines. Farms were combined into large collective farms, where thousands of peasants worked together instead of owning their own small pieces of land. This idea looked efficient on paper, but in reality, it brought great suffering. Many farmers did not want to give up their land or animals. When they resisted, they were punished harshly. Millions were forced to leave their homes, and in some regions, especially Ukraine, famine struck, killing millions. Under Stalin, the government controlled almost everything: newspapers, radio, schools, and even what people could say. Speaking against the government was dangerous. Secret police watched everyone, and those accused of being enemies of the people could be arrested at night and never seen again. Millions of innocent people were sent to labor camps called gulags, often in freezing parts of Siberia. There, they worked long hours in terrible conditions. The fear was real. People learned to stay silent, even if they disagreed. Yet, Stalin also achieved what he wanted: rapid industrial growth. In less than 2 decades, the Soviet Union transformed from a mostly rural country into an industrial giant. New cities, railways, and power plants were built. The USSR became one of the most powerful nations in the world. For the average Soviet citizen, life was a mix of pride and hardship. On one hand, there were free schools, free medical care, and jobs for everyone. On the other hand, there were shortages of food, long waiting lines, and strict rules. People learned to live with less, but were proud of belonging to a nation that stood tall against the West. Children grew up learning songs about the Communist Party and stories of brave Soviet heroes. Posters showed smiling workers building the future, farmers harvesting golden wheat, and soldiers guarding peace. There was little personal freedom, but there was a powerful sense of unity. The government told people that their sacrifices were necessary to build a great future, and many believed it. In the 1930s, while the Soviet Union was changing rapidly, trouble was growing in Europe. Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany, and soon the world would face another terrible conflict: World War II. At first, Stalin tried to stay out of it. He even signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, thinking it would keep the Soviet Union safe. But in 1941, Hitler betrayed that promise and invaded the Soviet Union in a massive attack known as Operation Barbarossa. The war was brutal beyond imagination. Cities were bombed, villages burned, and millions of soldiers and civilians died. Yet the Soviet people fought fiercely. They endured hunger, cold, and endless suffering, but refused to give up. The city of Leningrad was under siege for almost 900 days, but it never surrendered. The turning point came at the Battle of Stalingrad, where Soviet forces defeated the German army after months of bloody fighting. When the war ended in 1945, the Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million lives, but it had also become a global superpower. The Red Army had captured Berlin, and Stalin stood among the victors of the Second World War. After the war, the Soviet people celebrated victory. The USSR was now respected and feared around the world. It had proven its strength, rebuilt cities, and established control over much of Eastern Europe. The red flag now waved over many countries, from Poland to East Germany. But beneath the pride lay exhaustion and sadness. Families were broken, towns were destroyed, and the economy was in ruins. Still, Stalin's rule continued. He demanded more rebuilding, more production, and more loyalty. People whispered quietly about freedom, but few dared to speak openly. Stalin's control remained absolute. He believed that strict order was the only way to keep the country strong. By the early 1950s, the Soviet Union stood tall as a mighty empire, powerful in military, industry, and influence. Yet it was also a country of contrasts. It promised equality, but silenced those who spoke out. It celebrated progress, but feared change. People had learned to live double lives, one public, one private. In public, they praised the party and the leader. In private, they whispered their true thoughts to those they trusted most. Still, millions genuinely believed in the dream, the idea that one day the Soviet Union would lead humanity into a bright and fair future. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died. His death came as a shock to the nation. Some cried, others secretly felt relief. For the first time in decades, people wondered what might happen next. Would life become freer? Would the end? No one knew yet, but the Soviet Union was standing at a crossroads. It had risen from revolution and war to become one of the most powerful nations on Earth. Yet deep inside, cracks were already forming, cracks that would one day lead to its fall. But that, as we will see in the next chapter, was still far in the future. For now, the Soviet Union was alive, proud, powerful, and determined to shape the world in its own image. The world after World War II was like a deep breath after a storm. Cities lay in ruins, families were broken, and millions of people were gone. But from those ashes, two great powers rose higher than anyone else, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had fought on the same side against Nazi Germany, yet now they looked at each other with suspicion. One believed in democracy and capitalism, where people could own property, vote freely, and run private businesses. The other believed in communism, where the government controlled most things to make everyone equal. Both sides thought their way was right. Both wanted to spread their ideas across the planet. And so began a long, tense period in human history called the Cold War. The Cold War wasn't a war of bullets and bombs. It was a war of ideas, pride, and power. The name Cold meant that the two sides didn't fight each other directly. Instead, they competed in every other way, through politics, military strength, science, and even sports. After 1945, Europe was divided like a cracked mirror, and the West were countries supported by the United States, France, Britain, Italy, and others. In the East were countries controlled or heavily influenced by the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and more. A British leader named Winston Churchill gave this divide a famous name. He said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." The phrase described an invisible wall separating the free democratic West from the communist East. Behind that iron curtain, the Soviet Union built a group of allied nations called the Eastern Bloc. Each country had a communist government that followed Moscow's orders. In return, they received protection and support. In 1949, the United States and its allies created a military alliance called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to defend each other in case of attack. In response, the Soviets formed their own alliance in 1955, the Warsaw Pact. Now the world had two camps, each armed, each suspicious, and each afraid of the other's next move. After World War II, the United States had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The world had seen how a single bomb could destroy an entire city. The Soviet Union felt vulnerable. It needed the same weapon to stay powerful. In 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb. The arms race had begun. Soon both sides were building newer, stronger, and deadlier weapons: hydrogen bombs, intercontinental missiles, nuclear submarines. Each claimed these weapons were only for defense, but both stockpiled enough to destroy the world many times over. People everywhere lived under the shadow of fear. Schools in America practiced duck and cover drills, teaching children how to hide under desks during a nuclear attack. In the Soviet Union, citizens built underground shelters and were told that socialism would protect them from Western aggression. Even though there was no fighting, the tension felt constant, like a world holding its breath. After leading the country through war and rebuilding, Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with iron control until his death in 1953. When he died, millions mourned, some out of love, many out of fear, and others out of habit. His death opened the door for change. A new leader soon rose to power, Nikita Khrushchev. He was loud, energetic, and different from Stalin in many ways. In a surprising speech in 1956, Khrushchev publicly admitted that Stalin had committed terrible crimes. He called it the cult of personality, where one man's image became more important than truth. People were shocked. For years they had been taught to worship Stalin as almost a god. Now they learned that their leader had killed millions of his own people. Khrushchev promised a new start, less fear, more openness, and a better life. He released thousands of prisoners from labor camps, encouraged more freedom in art and science, and tried to improve living standards. Still, he believed firmly in communism and wanted to show that it could compete with the West. One of the most exciting parts of the Cold War was the race to space. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching the first artificial satellite Sputnik 1 into orbit. It was a small metal sphere with antennas that beeped as it circled the Earth. But that simple sound carried a powerful message. The Soviet Union had reached space first. The West was amazed and scared. If the USSR could send a satellite into space, it might also be able to send nuclear missiles across oceans. The United States quickly responded by creating NASA and investing heavily in science and technology. In 1961, the Soviet Union celebrated again when Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. "I see the Earth," he said from space. He returned home a hero, and his smiling face appeared on posters across the Soviet Union. This victory filled the Soviet people with pride. They believed communism had proven its strength to the world. During this time, ordinary Soviet life began to change. The country was still recovering from war, but progress was visible. New apartments replaced wooden huts, electricity reached remote villages, and more people went to school than ever before. Education was free, and the Soviet Union produced many scientists, doctors, and engineers. People were proud of their space program, their strong army, and their unity. Yet shortages were common. Long lines formed outside stores for meat, bread, or soap. Television and newspapers showed smiling citizens, but behind closed doors, many quietly wished for more freedom and variety. In the West, people could listen to rock and roll and buy colorful clothes. In the Soviet Union, life remained simpler and more controlled. Western movies and music were often banned because the government feared they would spread corrupt capitalist ideas. Still, many citizens believed they were building a fairer society, one that cared for everyone, not just the rich. Over time, the difference between the two halves of Berlin became clear. In the West, life was freer and wealthier. In the East, life was more controlled and poorer. Many East Germans began crossing over to West Berlin to seek better opportunities. The Soviet Union and the East German government feared losing their people, so in 1961, they built a wall across the city, the Berlin Wall. It stretched for miles, covered with barbed wire, guards, and watchtowers. Families were divided overnight. Soldiers patrolled to stop anyone from escaping. The Berlin Wall became the most famous symbol of the Cold War, a real physical line between two worlds. In 1962, the world came terrifyingly close to nuclear war. The United States had placed missiles in Turkey and Italy near Soviet borders. In response, Khrushchev secretly sent Soviet missiles to the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. When U.S. spy planes discovered them, President John F. Kennedy demanded that the missiles be removed. For 13 days, both sides stood on the edge of disaster. Soldiers were on alert, ships were ready, and the world watched in fear. Finally, an agreement was reached. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. quietly promised to remove its missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended peacefully, but it left both sides shaken. They realized that a single mistake could end the world. Soon after, a hotline, a direct telephone link between Moscow and Washington, was set up so that leaders could talk instantly in times of danger. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev wanted to improve relations with the West and focus on helping his people live better lives. He invested in housing and agriculture, famously promising, "We will bury capitalism not with war, but with our success." But problems continued. The Soviet economy struggled to keep up with rapid industrial and military spending. Farms were inefficient, and workers had little motivation because wages were the same regardless of effort. Meanwhile, some communist countries began to question Moscow's control. In 1968, in Czechoslovakia, a reform movement known as the Prague Spring tried to create socialism with a human face, more freedom and democracy within communism. The Soviet Union saw this as a threat. Tanks rolled into Prague to crush the movement. The message was clear: Moscow would not allow any country to go its own way. Many Soviet citizens were proud of their country's strength, but others quietly wondered if too much control was destroying creativity and hope. In 1964, Khrushchev was removed from power by his own party. They thought he was too unpredictable and emotional. His replacement was Leonid Brezhnev, a calm and disciplined man who promised stability. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union became more rigid again. He focused on maintaining power, keeping control, and competing with the United States for influence around the world. The Soviet military grew even larger, and its influence stretched across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The USSR supported communist movements and governments everywhere, from Cuba to Vietnam to Angola, while the United States supported the opposite side. This global struggle for allies and influence was called the Cold War game, and both sides spent billions trying to win it. The Cold War didn't always stay cold. Instead of fighting each other directly, the US and USSR often supported opposite sides in other countries' conflicts. These were called proxy wars. One of the biggest ones was the Vietnam War. The United States supported South Vietnam, a non-communist country, while the Soviet Union and China supported the North Vietnam. The war lasted years, cost millions of lives, and divided the world. When North Vietnam finally won in 1975, the Soviets saw it as proof that communism was spreading. But the war also showed how costly and painful these global competitions had become. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union looked strong on the outside. Its army was powerful, its influence stretched wide, and it had sent humans into space again and again. But inside, cracks were beginning to show. The economy was slowing down. Many factories were outdated, and there was little innovation. People joked that in the West, everything changed too fast, but in the Soviet Union, nothing changed at all. Stores still had shortages, corruption was common among officials, citizens could not freely travel abroad or criticize the government. However, the government maintained strict control over television, newspapers, and schools, making sure people heard only what leaders wanted them to hear. Despite these problems, Soviet citizens found joy in small things: family, friendships, books, music, and nature. Life went on quietly for most, even as the superpowers continued their uneasy dance of rivalry. In the 1970s, after decades of constant tension, both sides began to realize they couldn't stay enemies forever. The arms race was too expensive, and people were tired of fear. So, they began a period of détente, a French word meaning relaxation. The US and the USSR signed several agreements to limit nuclear weapons, such as the SALT treaties, strategic arms limitation talks. There were cultural exchanges. Musicians, artists, and athletes traveled between East and West. For a moment, it felt like the world might finally calm down. But détente didn't solve the deeper issues. The Soviet Union was spending enormous amounts of money on the military, leaving less for food, housing, and technology. Many young Soviets wanted change, but didn't dare speak openly. Writers who questioned the system were censored or sent away. Outside, the West continued to develop new computers, inventions, and lifestyles, while inside the Soviet Union, progress slowed. People still believed in their country's greatness, but some began to ask quietly, if we are the best system in the world, why is life still so hard? By the late 1970s, the Cold World had become familiar. Two superpowers staring at each other across oceans, both proud, both afraid, both tired. The Soviet Union stood tall but weary. Its people had endured revolution, terror, war, and decades of struggle. Now, they longed for peace, prosperity, and maybe a little freedom. No one knew it yet, but the next decade would bring new leaders, new ideas, and changes so big they would shake the Soviet Union to its very core. For now, the world remained divided, half red, half blue, living under the same sky, but separated by fear, walls, and words. By the end of the 1970s, the Soviet Union seemed unshakable. Its red flag flew over 1/6 of the Earth. It had one of the biggest armies, the most nuclear weapons, and millions of loyal citizens. From space stations orbiting Earth to tanks rolling through Eastern Europe, it looked like the Soviet dream was stronger than ever. But underneath that image of strength, something was changing. The cracks that would one day bring down the entire Soviet Union were already forming, quietly, slowly, and everywhere. To understand why the Soviet Union began to weaken, we have to look at daily life inside it. For most Soviet people, life followed a simple rhythm. Children went to school, adults went to work, and everyone obeyed the rules. On paper, everything sounded fair. Everyone had a job. Everyone had free health care and education. Rent was low, and basic needs were provided by the government. But there was one big problem. There was never enough of anything. Stores often had empty shelves. People stood in long lines for simple things like sugar, soap, or shoes. Sometimes, after waiting for hours, they went home with nothing. Cars were so hard to get that some people waited 10 or even 15 years to buy one. People used a common joke. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. It wasn't that Soviet people were lazy. Far from it. They worked hard. But the system was broken. Factories had no competition. Managers cared only about meeting the government's quotas, not quality. A shoe factory, for example, might make 1 million shoes that didn't fit anyone just to reach its production goal. This system, called the planned economy, was controlled entirely from the top. The government decided how many loaves of bread, cars, or socks should be made, not the people who actually used them. And that led to waste, inefficiency, and frustration. Still, people made the best of what they had. Families shared meals, sung songs, and took vacations to the Black Sea. Life was hard, but it was stable. Or at least it seemed that way. While ordinary citizens were busy living their lives, the leaders in Moscow faced growing problems they didn't want to admit. The Soviet economy, once the pride of the nation, was slowing down. The government spent massive amounts of money on the military and space programs, leaving little for housing or technology. Factories used outdated machines, and innovation was discouraged. Why take risks if your success didn't bring rewards? Scientists and engineers had brilliant ideas, but they had to follow rules and approval chains that made progress painfully slow. Meanwhile, the black market, illegal trading, began to grow. People secretly bought or sold goods that were hard to find in stores. Jeans, music records, chocolate, and even soap from the West became luxury treasures. Many young people began to admire Western culture, the music, movies, and freedom. They listened to rock bands like the Beatles or Queen in secret, even though such music was banned. They dreamed of traveling, of choosing their own future, of speaking freely. But the Soviet system didn't allow that. Speaking too honestly could cost you your job or worse. By the late 1970s, the Soviet government had become a huge, slow machine filled with bureaucracy. Thousands of officials, called party members, made decisions for the whole country. At first, these officials were meant to serve the people, but over time, many cared more about keeping power and privilege. They had better cars, better homes, and access to special stores with imported goods. Ordinary citizens began to notice the difference. People started losing faith. They no longer believed the speeches about equality and progress. They nodded in agreement during meetings, but rolled their eyes afterwards. The gap between what the government said and what people felt grew wider each year. Leonid Brezhnev, who had taken power in 1964, ruled for almost 2 decades. His time in charge is often called the era of stagnation. At first, Brezhnev brought stability. After Khrushchev's unpredictable leadership, people liked calmness. Factories ran smoothly, salaries came on time, and the threat of war seemed far away. But over time, stability turned into stillness. The same old leaders stayed in power for decades. Decisions were made slowly, and change was seen as dangerous. By the early 1980s, Brezhnev was an elderly man, rarely seen in public except during parades. The country's energy, once bold and ambitious, had faded. Even humor changed. Soviet citizens began making quiet jokes about their leaders. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. We have the best system, it just doesn't work anywhere. Behind the laughter was sadness. People wanted progress, but the government was afraid of it. In 1979, the Soviet Union made a decision that would haunt it for years. It sent its army into Afghanistan. The goal was to support a friendly communist government that was fighting against local rebels. The Soviet leaders thought it would be a quick operation, lasting a few months. Instead, it became a 10-year war that drained the country's money, morale, and global image. The rebels, called the Mujahideen, were tough fighters who knew the mountains well. They received weapons and support from the United States and other Western countries. For Soviet soldiers, the war was brutal. The heat, terrain, and guerrilla tactics made fighting extremely difficult. Thousands of young men died, and many others returned wounded, both physically and emotionally. At home, families were told it was a peace mission, but rumors spread that it was a disaster. People began questioning their leaders again. Why are we losing our sons in a foreign land? By the time the war ended in 1989, more than 15,000 Soviet soldiers had died and millions of Afghans were killed or displaced. It became the Soviet Union's version of America's Vietnam, a war that achieved little but weakened a superpower. Even under tight control, brave individuals began to speak up. Writers, scientists, and artists quietly challenged the government through their work. These people were called dissidents, voices of truth in a world of silence. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote books that exposed life in labor camps, like The Gulag Archipelago. His works were banned, but copies spread secretly from hand to hand. People read them at night, whispering about the horrors of the past that were never discussed openly. The government arrested many dissidents, calling them enemies of the state, but their courage inspired others. For the first time in decades, small groups of citizens began to hope for freedom of speech, religion, and movement. The system was too rigid to adapt, but the people's hearts were changing. While the Soviet Union focused on weapons and space, the West was moving ahead in another direction: computers and technology. By the 1980s, American and Japanese companies were building personal computers and developing new industries. Meanwhile, Soviet computers were outdated and scarce. Even copying Western designs was hard because of trade restrictions. This gap didn't just affect machines, it affected the entire economy. Without modern technology, factories became less efficient, production slowed, and profits fell. The Soviet Union still looked powerful, but it was slowly falling behind. It was like a giant running out of breath. A new generation of young Soviets had grown up who didn't remember the war or the revolution. They hadn't known hunger or chaos, but they also didn't feel inspired by endless talk of sacrifice and collective duty. They wanted comfort, color, and choice. They watched smuggled Western films and dreamed of traveling. Jeans, pop music, and Coca-Cola became silent symbols of freedom. The older generation still remembered the fear of Stalin and the pride of World War II victory. They valued safety and discipline. The younger generation valued freedom and expression. This silent divide between old and young widened, another invisible crack in the Soviet wall. After Brezhnev's death in 1982, the country's leadership began to look tired and out of touch. Two short-lived leaders followed: Yuri Andropov, 1982 to 1984, and Konstantin Chernenko, 1984 to 1985. Both were elderly and ill. They tried to fight corruption and improve discipline, but they were too weak and too old to bring real change. It felt like the Soviet Union was being ruled by men who belonged to another century. The people waited and hoped for someone new, someone young, someone who could breathe life back into the country. While the Soviet Union was standing still, the rest of the world was moving fast. In the United States, new technology and media were transforming life. Western Europe was becoming more united and prosperous. Even China, under Deng Xiaoping, was opening up its economy, mixing socialism with capitalism to attract growth. But in the Soviet Union, the old model of total control remained. The government still decided everything, from factory output to movie scripts. Ordinary people began to ask a dangerous question: why are everyone else doing better if our system is so perfect? By the mid-1980s, the cracks were no longer hidden. Economic stagnation, growth was slowing to almost zero. Corruption, party officials used power for personal gain. Public frustration, people were tired of lies, shortages, and restrictions. Afghanistan, the war drained money and morale. Technology gap, the West was leaping ahead. The Soviet machine still looked strong, but inside it was rusting. Everyone, from farmers to factory workers to generals, felt the system wasn't working anymore, yet no one dared to say it loudly. Change was risky. Too much freedom could bring chaos. Too little could lead to collapse. The government stood like a giant made of stone, heavy, impressive, but brittle. All it needed was one big shake. In March 1985, that shake arrived, in the form of a new leader. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and at 54, he was young, energetic, and full of ideas. He smiled in public, talked directly to citizens, and promised to make life better. He knew the truth: the Soviet Union couldn't survive if it didn't change. In his first speeches, he said the words that would define a new era: "We can't go on living like this." No Soviet leader had ever spoken so openly before. People were surprised and hopeful. They didn't yet know it, but Gorbachev's reforms would begin a chain of events that no one could stop, not even him. By the time Gorbachev took office, the Soviet Union was already standing on shaky ground. The cracks that had begun decades earlier, in corruption, control, and fear, were spreading faster. Gorbachev would try to fix them through honesty and openness. But once people began to speak freely, they would say things that had been buried for 70 years. The truth would shake the empire to its core. For now, the winds of change were just beginning to blow. And in those winds, you could almost hear the whisper of history saying, "The end is coming, not with bombs or battles, but with words, ideas, and truth." When Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, he was only 54 years old, young by Soviet standards. People immediately noticed something different about him. He smiled when he talked. He visited factories and spoke directly to workers. He walked among crowds instead of watching from a high platform. After decades of old, silent leaders, this felt refreshing. For the first time in years, Soviet citizens felt a small spark of hope. Gorbachev inherited a nation in serious trouble. The Soviet Union looked strong, but its economy was falling apart. Factories were producing low-quality goods, farms were inefficient, corruption had spread everywhere. The government spent more on weapons than on food and housing. The war in Afghanistan had already cost billions and destroyed thousands of lives. And on top of that, the people were tired of standing in long lines, tired of hearing the same speeches, tired of being afraid to speak honestly. Gorbachev saw this clearly. He realized that the Soviet Union couldn't survive if it kept living the same way. The system needed oxygen. It needed reform. Gorbachev's first big idea was called Perestroika, which means restructuring. He wanted to rebuild the Soviet economy from the inside out. For decades, every decision, how many shoes to make, how much wheat to grow, came from the top, from Moscow. Gorbachev believed that local managers and workers should have more control. He encouraged factories to think like businesses, produce better goods, save money, and sell more. He even allowed small private businesses for the first time since Lenin's days, cafes, repair shops, taxis, and small family stores. People could earn money on their own, something that had been unthinkable before. At first, this brought excitement. Citizens felt that maybe, finally, things would improve. But change in such a huge country was complicated. Factories didn't know how to operate without strict orders. Some managers took advantage of new freedoms to make quick profits. Prices rose, shortages continued, and people became confused. Still, Gorbachev believed it was the right path. He told his people, "Without reform, our country will fall behind. With reform, we will have a future." The second part of Gorbachev's plan was even more revolutionary. It was called Glasnost, which means openness. For the first time in Soviet history, people were allowed to speak freely, to discuss problems, criticize officials, and even question the government itself. Before Glasnost, news was carefully controlled. The newspapers only printed good stories, new factories, successful harvests, smiling workers. If something went wrong, it was hidden. If the government made a mistake, no one knew. Under Glasnost, all that changed. Newspapers began publishing real stories about pollution, corruption, and even crimes of the past. Television aired debates and interviews where people spoke honestly. Old films that had been banned were shown again. It was like opening a window in a house that had been sealed for 70 years. Fresh air rushed in, but also the dust that had been hiding everywhere. One of the biggest shocks of Glasnost came when people began to learn the truth about Stalin's rule. For decades, school books had praised him as a hero, a father of the nation. But now, historians began publishing real numbers. Millions imprisoned, millions starved, millions killed in purges. Families discovered that their grandparents or uncles had died in labor camps. People wept as they read letters and diaries from those who had disappeared. Gorbachev didn't want to destroy faith in the country. He wanted to heal it through truth. But once the truth started flowing, it couldn't be stopped. People began asking new questions. Why did our leaders lie to us for so long? Why do we still live in fear? If the system made these mistakes, can it ever be trusted again? By the late 1980s, Soviet life looked very different. Citizens could now speak their minds more openly. Writers published bold books. Rock bands performed songs about peace and change. People formed discussion clubs to talk about democracy and human rights. In Moscow, students marched with signs reading "Freedom of Speech for All." For the first time, Soviet citizens saw Western TV shows, music, and fashion without fear. Even religion, once banned from public life, began to return. Churches reopened. People openly celebrated Easter and Christmas again. The change felt electric. After decades of silence, voices filled the air. But not everyone was happy. Older party officials worried that Gorbachev was going too far. They feared that too much freedom would destroy the country's unity. And in some ways, they were right, because once people tasted freedom, they began demanding more than Gorbachev ever planned to give. One event in 1986 showed exactly why Glasnost was necessary and so dangerous for the old system. In April that year, a nuclear power plant in the city of Chernobyl in Ukraine exploded. It was one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. At first, local officials tried to hide it. They didn't warn people. Children played outside while invisible radioactive dust spread across the land. It took 2 full days before the Soviet government admitted that something had gone wrong, and only because Sweden detected radiation drifting over Europe. When the truth finally came out, citizens were furious. Thousands had been exposed to deadly radiation because of lies and secrecy. Chernobyl became a symbol of everything wrong with the old system: cover-ups, fear, and neglect. It also convinced millions that Glasnost was necessary, no matter how painful. If people couldn't know the truth, how could they ever be safe? Gorbachev also wanted to change how the Soviet Union acted in the world. For decades, the USSR had been locked in rivalry with the United States, two giants spending billions on weapons that everyone hoped would never be used. Gorbachev thought this was madness. He said, "We need fewer missiles and more bread." He met U.S. President Ronald Reagan several times. At first, they didn't trust each other, but slowly they began to build respect. In 1987, they signed the INF Treaty, agreeing to destroy thousands of nuclear missiles. It was the first real step toward ending the arms race. Gorbachev also began withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and reducing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. He told the world that the USSR would no longer interfere in other nations' affairs. For people across the globe, he became a symbol of peace and reason. He even won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. But at home, not everyone saw him as a hero. Some believed he was giving up too much power too fast. Hardliners in the Communist Party called him weak. Others thought he was betraying socialism itself. While Gorbachev was praised abroad, life inside the Soviet Union was becoming harder. Perestroika had opened the door to reform, but the system didn't know how to change. Old factories couldn't adjust to new rules. Managers were confused about pricing and production. Private businesses grew quickly, but many took advantage of shortages by charging high prices. Inflation rose, shelves were emptier than ever. Even basic food like butter, meat, and sugar became difficult to find. People began to say bitterly, "We got freedom, but we lost bread." Queues grew longer, tempers shorter. The same citizens who had once cheered Gorbachev's name now whispered complaints. They wanted results, not promises. For the first time, many began to think the unthinkable. Maybe communism itself no longer works. The Soviet Union was not one single country. It was a union of 15 republics, each with its own culture, language, and traditions. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Central Asian republics, and more. Under strict rule, these republics had been forced to live together as one. But with Glasnost came the right to speak freely. And soon, many republics began saying something very clear. We want independence. In the Baltic states, people formed human chains stretching for miles, singing songs of freedom. In Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, protests erupted demanding self-rule. Even in Ukraine, people began dreaming of a future without Moscow's control. Gorbachev wanted to keep the Union together through compromise, more autonomy, more rights, but under one flag. However, nationalism was spreading too fast. After decades of silence, each nation wanted its own voice, its own destiny. One of the most dramatic effects of Gorbachev's policies happened outside the Soviet borders, in Eastern Europe. For years, Soviet troops had kept communist governments in power in countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. But in 1989, Gorbachev announced something new. The Soviet Union would no longer use force to control its allies. That one decision changed everything. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Walesa, won free elections. In Hungary, the border with Austria was opened. And then, in East Germany, crowds began gathering at the Berlin Wall, the symbol of the Cold War. On November 9, 1989, border guards, overwhelmed and confused, opened the gates. People poured through, climbing, laughing, and tearing down the wall piece by piece. The world watched in amazement. Families who had been separated for 28 years hugged and cried. The Cold War's most famous barrier was gone. In Moscow, some hardliners were horrified. They thought Gorbachev had lost control. But for millions around the world, it was a moment of pure joy, a sign that freedom was stronger than fear. By 1990, the Soviet Union was changing faster than anyone could control. The Communist Party lost much of its authority. New political movements appeared overnight. People debated openly about democracy, capitalism, and independence. In 1990, Gorbachev allowed multi-party elections for the first time in Soviet history. Suddenly, citizens could vote for different candidates, not just the Communist Party. Televised debates filled living rooms. The word democracy, once forbidden, became part of everyday speech. But freedom also brought division. Some republics held their own elections and voted to leave the USSR. Others began refusing to send money or goods to Moscow. The unity that once seemed unbreakable was slowly falling apart. By this time, Gorbachev found himself trapped between two angry sides. Reformers said he wasn't moving fast enough. Hardliners said he was destroying everything. He tried to balance both, reforming the system without breaking it. But history rarely allows both change and control at the same time. Food shortages grew worse. Strikes and protests spread across cities. The once powerful Soviet Union now looked uncertain, fragile, and divided. Gorbachev's approval dropped sharply. In the streets, people began shouting the name of another rising figure, Boris Yeltsin, a bold reformer who believed the only way forward was to end the old system entirely. The two men would soon stand on opposite sides of history. Despite all the chaos, something beautiful was happening too. People were speaking their minds without fear. Newspapers were alive with debate. Citizens could travel, start businesses, join clubs, or even criticize leaders openly. For the first time, the Soviet people felt what true freedom meant. But freedom came with confusion, too. For 70 years, the government had told them what to think, what to do, and what to believe. Now, that control was gone, and many didn't know what to believe anymore. The ground beneath the Soviet Union was shifting, and no one, not even Gorbachev himself, could predict where it would lead. By the start of 1991, the Soviet Union was no longer the same country it had been just a few years before. Its economy was collapsing, republics were demanding independence, and the Communist Party was losing power day by day. Gorbachev still hoped to save the Union with a new, looser agreement, a union treaty that would give republics more freedom but keep them together. But not everyone agreed. In secret, a group of hardline leaders began plotting to stop him. They believed they could restore order by force. In August 1991, they would make their move, and the world would watch as the final act of the Soviet Union began. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union was no longer the same nation that had once stood so proudly against the West. For decades, it had ruled with iron discipline, its word law, its power unquestioned. But now, the world was changing faster than the old order could handle. The Berlin Wall had fallen, Eastern Europe was free, and the Soviet people were demanding a new life built on truth and freedom. Yet, inside the Kremlin, not everyone was ready for that freedom. Some wanted to move forward. Others wanted to turn back time. Between these two forces, the Soviet Union was pulled apart until it finally broke. The year 1989 was like a wave sweeping across Eastern Europe. For decades, the Soviet Union had kept a tight grip on its allies. Soviet tanks had crushed uprisings in Hungary, 1956, and Czechoslovakia, 1968. But Gorbachev had promised that there would be no more violence. Every nation could choose its own path. And so, country by country, the communist governments fell. In Poland, the Solidarity movement won free elections. In Hungary, barbed wire was cut along its border with Austria. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution brought peaceful change. And in East Germany, the people tore down the Berlin Wall with their own hands. The world watched in awe. After 40 years of division, Europe was being reborn. For the Soviet Union, these events were both a triumph and a tragedy. Gorbachev was praised abroad for allowing peaceful change, but at home, many called him a traitor. They said he had lost the Soviet Empire without a fight. Inside the USSR itself, a similar wave of change was spreading. Each of the 15 republics had its own language, flag, and identity, and now each wanted more power. In Lithuania, citizens marched through the streets singing old national songs that had been banned for decades. In Georgia and Armenia, thousands demanded independence. Even in Russia, the largest republic, people began to say openly that Moscow should stop controlling everyone else. For the first time, the idea of a single Soviet Union began to look fragile. The once united empire was becoming a collection of voices, each crying, "We want to be free." Gorbachev tried to find balance. He didn't want the USSR to die. He wanted to save it through reform. He proposed a new union treaty which would give the republics more freedom to govern themselves while still remaining part of one country. But for many, it was too late. They no longer trusted the central government. Among the new voices of change was a man from Russia named Boris Yeltsin. Once a member of the Communist Party, he had grown disillusioned with its corruption and slow bureaucracy. Yeltsin spoke plainly. He walked among crowds, listened to ordinary people, and criticized the party openly. To many Soviet citizens, he seemed brave, a man of the people. In 1990, Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Republic, the largest of the 15 republics inside the USSR. He believed that Russia should have control over its own future, even if that meant standing up to Gorbachev. Two leaders now stood at the center of history. Gorbachev, trying to reform the Union and hold it together. Yeltsin, ready to let it go and build a new, democratic Russia. The stage was set for a power struggle that would decide the fate of an empire. For ordinary Soviet citizens, life in the early 1990s was harder than ever. Stores were empty. Money lost value fast. Lines for bread stretched around blocks. People sold belongings on street corners just to buy food. Factories were closing. The state no longer had enough money to pay workers regularly. For a nation that had once boasted of full employment, unemployment was a new and painful experience. Yet something else was also new. Freedom. People spoke openly in cafes and parks. Newspapers printed the truth. Artists painted freely. It was a strange mix of hope and hunger, of poverty and possibility. For some, this was the best time of their lives. For others, it was the worst. Then came August 1991, a month that would decide the Soviet Union's fate. By that time, Gorbachev was on vacation at his dacha holiday home in Crimea, finalizing the Union Treaty. Many republics had agreed to sign it within days. It would give them more independence but keep the USSR alive in a new form. But for some hardline leaders in Moscow, they were furious. They believed Gorbachev's reforms had gone too far, that he was destroying the nation. These men included the head of the KGB, the defense minister, and other top officials. In secret, they formed a group called the State Committee on the State of Emergency. Their plan was simple: remove Gorbachev, declare martial law, and take back control. On August 19, 1991, they struck. Tanks rolled into Moscow before sunrise. State television announced that Gorbachev was ill and that the committee was taking charge to restore order. They banned demonstrations and censored news. Soldiers surrounded the parliament building, known as the White House. But the people did not stay silent. Thousands poured into the streets to protest. They built barricades of buses and cars around the White House. Inside that building stood Boris Yeltsin. He refused to recognize the coup leaders. Climbing on top of a tank outside the building, he held a megaphone and declared, "We will not let democracy be taken away." Photos and videos of that moment spread worldwide. A man standing on a tank, calm, firm, defiant, became a symbol of courage. Crowds cheered. More soldiers refused to follow orders. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. The plotters were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, free, but weakened.
The real winner of those days was Yeltsin. He was hailed as a hero who had defended freedom. And from that moment, it was clear that power in the Soviet Union had shifted, not to the Communist Party, not to Gorbachev, but to the people and their new leader in Russia. After the coup, nothing could stop the breakup. Republic after republic declared independence. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were the first, recognized internationally by autumn 1991. Ukraine followed on August 24, holding a referendum where over 90% voted for freedom. By December, even Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan had left the Union. The Communist Party was banned in Russia. Its red flags were taken down from buildings that had once been untouchable. Inside the Kremlin, Gorbachev watched as the nation he had tried to save was falling apart before his eyes. He still hoped to form a loose confederation, some kind of United States of Eurasia, but the will was gone. The people wanted a fresh start, not a repaired past. On December 8, 1991, a historic meeting took place in a forest villa in Belarus called Belavezha. 3 leaders attended: Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus. They sat around a wooden table and signed a simple but world-changing document, the Belavezha Accords. It stated, "The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics no longer exists as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality." In its place, they announced a new organization, the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. When Gorbachev heard the news, he was shocked. He had not been consulted. The country he led had just been dissolved without him. As December 1991 came to an end, the world watched a scene that no one had imagined possible. Inside the Kremlin, workers were taking down the Soviet flag, the red banner with the hammer and sickle that had flown for nearly 70 years. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television for the last time as president of the USSR. He spoke calmly, his voice steady but filled with sadness. "I am ending my work as president of the Soviet Union. The Union is no more." Outside, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. Moments later, a new flag, the white, blue, and red tricolor of Russia, was raised in its place. The world held its breath. The superpower that had shaped the 20th century was gone. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was peaceful but enormous in impact. 15 independent countries emerged overnight: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Each had its own flag, anthem, and government. Borders that once did not exist now divided families and friends. For the West, it was a moment of astonishment. The Cold War, the great rivalry that had defined half a century, was over without a single battle. In the United States, people celebrated the victory of democracy, but in the former Soviet lands, the feelings were mixed. Some rejoiced at freedom, others wept for a country that had been their home for generations. For ordinary people, the end of the Soviet Union brought confusion and hardship. The ruble collapsed in value, savings disappeared, prices skyrocketed while wages stayed the same. Factories closed and unemployment rose. Old guarantees, free health care, jobs for all, stable housing vanished almost overnight. Elderly citizens who had once been proud of their country now felt lost. In Russia, Yeltsin's government began transforming the economy into capitalism, selling state industries to private owners. A new class of wealthy businessmen emerged, while millions struggled to survive. Freedom had come, but it came with chaos. History would remember Mikhail Gorbachev in many ways. To some, he was a hero, the man who ended the Cold War peacefully, who brought openness and freedom. To others, he was a failure, the man who let a superpower collapse. But one truth is clear. He changed the world not through war, but through words. He believed that people should live without fear, that truth should be stronger than lies, and that peace was more powerful than control. Even after stepping down, he remained a respected figure internationally, though his own people never forgave him completely. With the Soviet Union gone, Boris Yeltsin became president of the new Russian Federation. He promised democracy, reform, and prosperity. The new Russian flag waved over the Kremlin, a symbol of rebirth. But building a new nation out of the ruins of an empire was not easy. The economy was collapsing, political power struggles erupted, and old Soviet structures didn't disappear overnight. Still, for better or worse, a new chapter in history had begun. The Cold War was over. The world had entered a new era, one shaped not by ideology, but by globalization, technology, and uncertain hope. On a cold night in Moscow, after the red flag came down, many people stood silently in the streets. They had grown up as Soviet citizens. Now, suddenly, that country no longer existed. Some cried, some smiled, most just stared at the sky, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The snow fell softly on the Kremlin towers, covering the last traces of an empire that had once dreamed of ruling the future. The Soviet Union, born from revolution, built through struggle, and ended in silence, had finally come to rest. And with its fall, the 20th century itself began to turn the page. When the red flag came down over the Kremlin on December 25, 1991, the world stood still. For the first time in 70 years, there was no Soviet Union. The empire that had once stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, that had sent humans to space and stood toe-to-toe with the United States, was gone. In its place were 15 new countries, each suddenly free, each uncertain about the future. The Cold War had ended not with bombs, but with silence, a quiet shift that changed everything. The map of the world looked different overnight. Where one giant once stood, there were now 15 independent republics. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Each of them raised their own flag and sang their own anthem. Each began to rediscover its language, culture, and history, things that had often been hidden under Soviet control. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, people celebrated their long-awaited freedom. They rejoined Europe, opened their borders, and built democracies. In Ukraine, citizens felt pride and hope, believing independence would bring prosperity and peace. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, the picture was more complicated. Some countries faced political struggles, poverty, or ethnic conflict as they tried to stand on their own. The Soviet Union had held them all together by force. Now they had to learn how to live apart by choice. The largest and most powerful of the new nations was Russia, led by Boris Yeltsin. It inherited most of the Soviet Union's military forces, nuclear weapons, and international responsibilities, but also most of its problems. The Soviet economy had been collapsing for years. Now it completely fell apart. Shops were empty, factories closed, and inflation skyrocketed. The government tried to switch quickly from a planned economy to a free market system. This was called shock therapy. Prices were no longer controlled, and suddenly everything became expensive. Ordinary people watched their savings vanish overnight. At the same time, a small group of businessmen, later called oligarchs, became incredibly rich by buying up former state industries for almost nothing. Powerful new fortunes were made, while millions sank into poverty. Freedom had come, but it came with chaos. For many Russians, the 1990s felt like a storm, full of hope, danger, and uncertainty all at once. Around the world, people realized that a whole chapter of human history had closed. The Cold War, which had dominated global politics for nearly half a century, was over. The world no longer lived under the constant fear of nuclear war. The United States emerged as the only remaining superpower. Many believed that peace and democracy would now spread everywhere. The phrase "New World Order" became popular, the idea that nations could finally cooperate instead of compete. But history is never that simple. The fall of the Soviet Union solved some problems and created new ones. Without a strong central power, old tensions resurfaced. Ethnic conflicts broke out in places like Chechnya, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Georgia. Weapons from Soviet arsenals spread across borders, and millions of people suddenly found themselves in new countries, with new passports and uncertain identities. Some missed the old days of stability and pride. Others embraced the new freedom, even if it was difficult. For the generation that had lived their whole lives as Soviet citizens, the collapse was deeply personal. They had grown up singing Soviet songs, studying Soviet heroes, and believing that their country was the greatest on earth. Now, that country no longer existed. Some felt lost, as if their roots had been pulled from the ground. Elderly veterans who had fought in World War II wept when they saw the red flag lowered. They had sacrificed everything for the Soviet Union, and now it was just a memory. Younger people were divided. Some embraced Western culture, jeans, music, Hollywood movies, new businesses. Others felt angry that the promises of freedom brought only poverty and confusion. The 1990s were a time of contradictions, laughter and hunger, freedom and fear, dreams and disappointment. After the Soviet Union collapsed, relations between Russia and the West changed dramatically. For a short time, there was friendship. Western leaders praised Gorbachev and Yeltsin for ending the Cold War peacefully. The United States and Europe sent aid and offered advice on how to build a market economy. Russia joined international organizations and began to open up to the world. But as years passed, disagreements grew again. Many Russians felt humiliated. They had lost their empire, their pride, and their influence. The West saw Russia as a new democracy. Many Russians saw it as a country that had been weakened and ignored. This quiet resentment would shape the next decades of global politics. Even after stepping down, Mikhail Gorbachev remained a symbol of change. He appeared at conferences, wrote books, and spoke about peace and democracy. He believed that history would judge him kindly, not for what he destroyed, but for what he made possible. When asked if he regretted his actions, he once replied calmly, "I wanted to give people freedom. What they did with it is their choice." Outside Russia, he was celebrated as the man who ended the Cold War without bloodshed. Inside Russia, opinions were mixed. Some saw him as a visionary, others as the man who broke their world apart. But whatever people thought, his reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika, had changed history forever. He showed that even the strongest system can fall if it refuses to listen to its people. Even though the Cold War officially ended, its shadow never fully disappeared. The military alliances remained, NATO in the West now expanding into former Soviet territories. The United States kept its global influence, and Russia tried to rebuild its own. Old rivalries and suspicions lingered hidden beneath polite smiles and handshakes. For a brief moment, it seemed that the world might finally unite. But new conflicts soon arose, in the Balkans, in the Middle East, and later, even between Russia and its neighbors. The lessons of the past were not easily forgotten. In the former Soviet republics, ordinary people faced enormous adjustments. In Ukraine and Belarus, the transition to independence brought both pride and hardship. In the Central Asian republics, traditions and religion returned to daily life after decades of suppression. In the Baltic states, schools switched from Russian to their native languages. Life felt freer, but also uncertain. Many people had to start from nothing. Farmers no longer had collective farms. Teachers and doctors went months without pay. Engineers who had built rockets and satellites now sold fruit in markets to survive. But slowly new generations grew up, ones that never knew the Soviet Union. For them, freedom, smartphones, and the internet were normal. The old world faded into history, remembered mostly in stories told by parents and grandparents. Even though the Soviet Union no longer exists, its legacy is still felt everywhere. It left behind great achievements, space exploration, science, education, and art that inspired millions. It also left behind deep wounds, wars, repression, and a fear of freedom that took decades to heal. It proved that human beings can achieve incredible progress when united for a goal, but also that power without honesty can destroy even the strongest empire. From Lenin to Stalin, from Khrushchev to Gorbachev, the Soviet story is both inspiring and tragic, a reminder that history is made not only by leaders, but by millions of ordinary people who live through their decisions. The fall of the Soviet Union taught the world several important lessons. No system lasts forever. Even the mightiest empire can collapse if it stops listening to its people. Freedom and stability must go together. Too much control suffocates a nation. Too much chaos can tear it apart. Truth matters. Lies and secrecy may hold power for a time, but truth always finds a way to surface. Peace is priceless. The Cold War could have ended in nuclear disaster, but it ended with dialogue and courage instead. These lessons remain important, not just for Russia, but for all nations that face the choice between control and freedom, pride and compassion, fear and hope. Today, the Soviet Union exists only in history books, photographs, and memories, but its story continues to shape our world, in politics, in technology, in culture, and even in the way we think about power. The world that followed its fall is more connected than ever before, yet still haunted by old divisions. In many ways, humanity is still learning how to live without the fear and rivalry that once defined the 20th century. And in the cities once ruled by Moscow, from Tallinn to Tashkent, from Kyiv to Vladivostok, life goes on. Children go to school, markets buzz with trade, and new generations dream of their own futures, free from the shadows of the past. Sometimes, on quiet nights in Moscow, old songs from the Soviet years still play on the radio. They tell stories of workers, soldiers, and space explorers, of dreams that once united millions. For those who remember, the sound brings nostalgia, not for control or fear, but for a time when people believed in a common purpose. History moves on, but the echo of the Soviet Union lingers, a reminder of how much humanity can achieve and how fragile that greatness can be. The Soviet Union began with revolution and ended with resignation. But between those two moments lies one of the greatest human stories ever told. A story of ambition, struggle, faith, and change. The red flag once symbolized the hope of equality and the power of unity. When it fell, it marked not just the end of a country, but the end of an idea, that a perfect society could be built through control and strength alone. The fall of the Soviet Union taught the world that true strength lies in openness, truth, and the will of ordinary people. And though the empire is gone, its story lives on, in books, in memories, and in the lessons we carry forward. The Cold War has ended, but its history continues to shape every corner of our modern world. As the 20th century came to a close, the world was quieter, but wiser. The Soviet Union's rise and fall had shown both the power and the limits of human ambition. In the end, it wasn't war or invasion that ended it. It was change, slow, inevitable, and human. The Soviet Union began with the dream of creating heaven on earth. It ended when people decided that no dream was worth more than freedom itself. And so, on a cold December night in 1991, as the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, humanity entered a new age, one shaped not by empires, but by the eternal hope that we can learn, rebuild, and begin again.